What does it mean when a country offers to give up one of its most powerful strategic advantages? Not after winning a conflict, not after securing a favorable agreement, but while still facing intense economic pressure and ongoing diplomatic negotiations. That question sits at the center of the latest developments surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical maritime choke points. For decades, the strait has represented far more than a narrow stretch of water connecting the Persian Gulf to global markets. Roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through this corridor, making it one of the most strategically important shipping lanes on Earth. For nearly half a century, Iranian leaders have repeatedly pointed to the strait as one of their strongest geopolitical bargaining tools. Whenever regional tensions escalated, the possibility of disrupting maritime traffic became part of the broader strategic conversation, not because Iran necessarily intended to close the waterway permanently, but because even the possibility of disruption could influence global energy markets and international diplomacy. Today, however, the conversation appears to be changing. According to multiple public reports, Iranian officials have recently floated proposals through regional diplomatic channels suggesting that commercial shipping through the strait could return to normal under certain conditions. If accurate, that represents a significant shift. The proposal is not simply about reopening shipping lanes. It suggests that Tehran may now be placing greater priority on protecting other national interests, particularly those related to its nuclear program, than on preserving the strait itself as its primary source of strategic leverage. That distinction matters, because it tells us something about how Iranian decision-makers may currently assess their own security environment. To understand why, we need to look back at the events of earlier this year. Following the major military exchanges that unfolded during the first half of 2026, Iran's conventional military capabilities faced substantial pressure. Public reporting and satellite assessments suggested damage to portions of its missile infrastructure, naval assets, and several facilities connected to its broader defense network. The exact scale of those losses remains disputed, but regardless of differing assessments, one conclusion appears increasingly consistent among defense analysts. Iran now faces a conventional military balance that remains heavily unfavorable when compared with the combined capabilities of the United States and its regional partners. That reality may explain why Tehran appears increasingly focused on preserving what it considers its most valuable long-term strategic asset, its nuclear infrastructure. For years, outside observers often described Iran's nuclear program primarily as a bargaining chip, something that can be expanded, slowed, or negotiated depending on political circumstances. Recent developments suggest the leadership in Tehran may now view it differently. Instead of treating the program as leverage to obtain concessions, it may increasingly see it as the foundation of its future deterrence strategy. If that assessment is correct, and the current diplomatic signals begin to make far more sense, a country under pressure will naturally prioritize protecting what it believes is most essential to its long-term security. Everything else, including economic concessions, maritime arrangements, and temporary diplomatic compromises, can become negotiable if those measures help preserve what leaders consider the core of national deterrence. Whether that strategy ultimately succeeds remains uncertain, but it helps explain why negotiations today appear to revolve less around shipping routes and more around the future of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Because from Tehran's perspective, reopening the strait may be a concession. Protecting the nuclear program is not. And that brings us to the next piece of the story. Because to understand why this issue has become so central, we need to examine one location that has attracted growing attention from military planners and intelligence analysts alike. A deeply buried facility in central Iran that many believe represents one of the country's most heavily protected strategic sites and one of the most difficult military targets anywhere in the region. To understand why Iran appears unwilling to compromise on its nuclear infrastructure, we need to examine one location that has become increasingly important in discussions among military analysts. It is not a missile base. It is not a naval facility. And it is not one of the nuclear sites that has dominated headlines for years. Instead, it is a deeply buried complex in central Iran that open-minded source analysts commonly refer to as Pakast Mountain. Located near Iran's broader nuclear infrastructure in Isfahan province, the facility has attracted growing attention because of one defining characteristic: its depth. Unlike conventional hardened bunkers, which are protected by reinforced concrete, facilities like Pakast Mountain are believed to be carved directly into solid mountain rock. Public satellite imagery and engineering assessments suggest portions of the complex may lie hundreds of feet beneath the surface, using natural geology as an additional layer of protection. From a military perspective, that changes everything. Modern precision-guided weapons are exceptionally accurate, but accuracy alone does not guarantee success against deeply buried targets. The challenge is no longer finding the facility. The challenge is reaching it. That is why the United States has spent years developing specialized bunker-penetrating weapons designed specifically for hardened underground structures. Among them is the GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator, a newer generation bunker-busting munition intended to defeat reinforced underground facilities that earlier weapons struggled to penetrate. During previous operations against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, publicly released information indicated that penetrating weapons were used against ventilation shafts, tunnel entrances, and supporting infrastructure rather than attempting to destroy an entire mountain outright. Military planners generally understand that underground complexes are systems, not simply caverns hidden beneath rock. Ventilation, electrical power, communications, access tunnels, logistics corridors. Every underground facility depends on those systems to remain operational. Disrupting them can sometimes reduce a site's effectiveness even if the deepest chambers remain physically intact. That distinction is important, because the strategic objective is not always total destruction. Sometimes it is long-term disruption. This is precisely why analysts believe facilities like Tokosk Mountain continue to matter. If Iran has concentrated key enrichment equipment, engineering expertise, or critical components inside deeply protected locations, those facilities become far more than storage sites. They become the backbone of the country's long-term nuclear capability. In other words, protecting existing uranium stockpiles is only part of the equation. Protecting the ability to produce more material in the future may be even more important. From Tehran's perspective, preserving that capability helps ensure that the program could continue even after significant military pressure. That logic also helps explain Iran's continued investment in underground construction over the past 2 decades. Around the world, militaries have increasingly recognized that fixed-surface installations are highly vulnerable to precision strikes. Deep underground facilities offer greater survivability, longer operational endurance, and more time for decision-makers during a crisis. Iran is not unique in following that logic. Several countries have invested heavily in hardened command centers, underground missile bases, and protected military infrastructure. The difference is that Iran's nuclear facilities occupy an especially sensitive position within regional security calculations. Every additional layer of protection increases the complexity of any potential military operation, and every increase in complexity affects political decision-making. Because military capability is only one side of the equation, the other is cost. The more difficult a target becomes, the greater the operational risks, the greater the resources required, and the higher the political consequences if an operation fails to achieve its objectives. That is why underground facilities remain central to the broader strategic balance, not because they are invulnerable, but because they force every potential adversary to think much more carefully before acting. And that strategic calculation does not end inside Iran, because the next chapter of this story involves 2 countries watching events just as closely: Russia and China. Their diplomatic support, military technology, and intelligence capabilities could all influence how the regional balance develops over the months ahead. While much of the world's attention remains focused on Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, another part of the story is unfolding behind the scenes. No major regional crisis exists in isolation. Every decision made in Tehran is closely watched in Moscow. Every military assessment in Washington is analyzed in Beijing. And every shift in the Persian Gulf carries consequences far beyond the Middle East. For Russia, the current situation presents both risks and opportunities. As one of the world's largest energy exporters, Moscow benefits when global oil markets become more volatile. Higher energy prices can generate additional export revenue, providing economic breathing room at a time when Russia continues to face international sanctions and prolonged military commitments elsewhere. That does not necessarily mean Russia seeks a wider regional conflict. Prolonged instability carries significant risks for everyone involved, but it does mean Moscow has strong incentives to preserve influence in Tehran while avoiding a complete collapse of Iran's strategic position. This explains why discussions surrounding advanced Russian air-defense systems continue to attract attention. Among the systems most frequently mentioned by defense analysts is the S-400 Triumph, one of Russia's most capable long-range surface-to-air missile systems. If deployed in sufficient numbers, integrated with existing radar networks, and supported by trained operators, such systems could complicate future air operations by increasing the range and sophistication of Iran's layered air defenses. However, it is important to distinguish capability from certainty. Receiving advanced equipment is only one step. Integrating that equipment into a functioning national air-defense architecture requires logistics, training, maintenance, command integration, and time. Modern warfare depends on systems, not individual weapons. China's role is different. Rather than direct military involvement, Beijing's interests center largely on regional stability, energy security, and strategic competition with the United States. China imports a substantial portion of its energy from the Middle East. Any disruption of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz directly affects Chinese economic interests. At the same time, Beijing continues expanding its investments in satellite surveillance, space-based intelligence, and long-range reconnaissance capabilities. These technologies improve overall situational awareness, allowing countries to monitor naval deployments, military exercises, and infrastructure activity with increasing precision. Open-minded source analysts generally agree that space-based intelligence has become one of the defining features of modern conflict. Today, military movements that once remained hidden for weeks can often be identified within hours. Large naval formations, strategic bomber deployments, construction at military facilities. Even changes in aircraft dispersal patterns can provide valuable clues about future intentions. The battlefield has become increasingly transparent. That transparency extends beneath the surface as well. Modern naval operations rely on far more than destroyers and aircraft carriers. Submarines, maritime patrol aircraft, autonomous underwater vehicles, seabed sensors, and integrated acoustic surveillance systems all contribute to a shared operational picture, rather than depending on a single platform. Today's naval commanders combine information from dozens of independent sources into one continuously updated network. This networked approach fundamentally changes maritime warfare. A destroyer may detect surface contacts. A patrol aircraft monitors the airspace. A submarine quietly tracks underwater activity. Satellites observe movements from orbit. Individually, each platform provides only part of the picture. Together, they create a level of situational awareness that previous generations of commanders could scarcely imagine. This broader technological transformation helps explain why freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz remains so closely monitored. The issue is no longer simply controlling the waterway. It is about controlling information, knowing who is moving, where they are moving, and what they may intend to do next. In many ways, modern conflicts are increasingly decided by information superiority before weapons are ever employed. Yet despite all this technology, perhaps the greatest challenge facing Iran today is not military. It is internal. Because even the most sophisticated defense systems cannot solve growing economic pressure, political divisions, and difficult strategic choices at home. And that is where the final chapter of this story begins. As attention remains fixed on military deployments, underground facilities, and international negotiations, the most important developments may actually be taking place inside Iran itself. History has shown that prolonged geopolitical crises rarely place pressure on only one front. Military pressure, economic pressure, and political pressure often reinforce one another. Over time, they become increasingly difficult to separate. Iran now finds itself managing all three simultaneously. Years of sanctions, followed by recent military exchanges and continued uncertainty surrounding international negotiations, have placed additional strain on the country's economy. Inflation remains high. The national currency has experienced significant volatility. Businesses face continued uncertainty. And energy exports, one of the government's most important sources of revenue, remain vulnerable to regional instability. For ordinary Iranian families, these pressures are measured not in military statistics, but in everyday life. The cost of food, the availability of consumer goods, employment opportunities, and confidence in the future. These are the issues that shape public sentiment far more directly than diplomatic statements or military briefings. Inside the government, different institutions naturally approach these challenges from different perspectives. Civilian officials generally focus on economic recovery, international trade, and reducing external pressure. Security institutions, meanwhile, place greater emphasis on deterrence, military readiness, and preserving national defense capabilities. These priorities do not necessarily conflict, but during periods of crisis, balancing them becomes increasingly difficult. That balancing act helps explain why negotiations often move more slowly than outside observers expect. Every diplomatic proposal must also satisfy domestic political considerations. Every security decision carries economic consequences, and every economic concession raises questions about national security. In other words, diplomacy is not taking place only across the negotiating table. It is also unfolding within the institutions of the Iranian state itself. At the same time, the broader strategic clock continues to move. Energy markets remain sensitive to developments in the Gulf. Regional militaries continue maintaining elevated readiness levels. Naval forces remain deployed across key maritime routes. and intelligence agencies continue monitoring developments with extraordinary attention. None of these actions necessarily indicate that conflict is inevitable. Rather, they reflect how governments prepare for multiple possible outcomes simultaneously. That is the defining characteristic of strategic uncertainty. Military planners prepare for escalation. Diplomats continue searching for compromise. Markets react to both. Looking ahead, several paths remain possible. Negotiations could eventually restore some form of international inspection mechanism. Regional tensions could gradually ease through diplomatic agreements, while the current period of uncertainty could persist much longer, with both sides attempting to gain leverage while avoiding direct confrontation. At this stage, no responsible analyst can say with confidence which outcome is most likely. What is clear, however, is that the debate has evolved far beyond a single shipping lane or a single underground facility. The Strait of Hormuz remains strategically important. Iran's nuclear infrastructure remains strategically important, but the larger issue is how regional security will be managed in an era where military technology, economic pressure, and geopolitical competition are becoming increasingly interconnected. This is no longer simply a dispute over access, sanctions, or inspections. It is a test of whether deterrence, diplomacy, and verification can still function together in one of the world's most strategically sensitive regions. The coming weeks and months will provide more answers. Until then, every statement, every diplomatic meeting, every satellite image, and every military movement will continue to be examined for clues about what comes next. Because in today's security environment, understanding the broader strategic picture often matters just as much as understanding the events themselves. And that is the story we will continue following.